8:08. Thanks very much, Anne. And you're listening to Good Morning Scotland with Gary Robertson and Bill Whiteford. It was the worst treatment disaster in the history of the National Health Service. Close to 3,000 people died as a result of being given infected blood products imported from America in the 1970s and 80s. Tens of thousands more have suffered a lifetime of ill effects. Andy Evans was just 5 years old when he received a transfusion. He developed hepatitis B and C and HIV, which became AIDS by the time he was 16.
It was a waiting game to die. For 4 years I struggled in and out of hospital, waiting to die. People were frightened of AIDS, and people were frightened of people who had AIDS. And so there was no telling anybody. This was something that we had to keep completely to ourselves. I was lucky in that I was quite young, if you can put it that way, when I was infected. And I could talk to my parents about it because they already knew. People who were diagnosed when they were older were warned to keep it away from everybody, including their family and their parents. And they had nobody to talk to about it.
Well, Scotland carried out its own investigation, the Penrose Inquiry, delivering its findings 4 years ago. Its conclusion that there was little the NHS could have done differently was dismissed by campaigners as a whitewash.
Well, last year a fresh UK-wide investigation was launched, promising to examine whether there was a cover-up by the authorities. Speaking at the outset, the QC, Eleanor Gray, told the inquiry that the UK government accepted that things went badly wrong.
I say unreservedly that we are sorry. We are sorry that this should be so, that this happened when it should not have done. This is the beginning of a journey to uncover exactly what happened and why. But from those I represent, it begins with an expression of sorrow and regret.
Well, today the inquiry is due to begin hearing evidence from the Scottish victims of the scandal when hearings get underway in Edinburgh. Let's go live to the capital and speak to the Chief Executive Officer of Haemophilia Scotland, Dan Farthing, and Gill Fyffe, whose blood was infected 30 years ago. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Gill, take us back to the 1980s and just tell us what happened.
I was given a transfusion after the birth of our daughter, which I didn't want because I said I only wanted if I'm in an emergency situation. And without going into all the details, I was given blood in a non-emergency sense. And 7 years later, I received a letter from the blood transfusion service telling me that the donation had been contaminated with hepatitis C.
And how devastating was it to read that letter?
Well, people remark on the fact now that I very often say when the letter came, because I knew in that instant that my life was changed forever. And I also, in that instant, that began the great fear that I would infect my children. In that moment, I was worried that I had infected them because nobody told me I was infected for 7 years. I quickly had them tested and they were not infected. But then there was a battle over the years to make sure they stayed not infected.
And what effect has this contaminated blood had on your life in terms of your health and other aspects of day-to-day living?
I was eventually, after 2 courses of interferon, cured of hepatitis, but if one has a predisposition to an overactive immune system, then in about 1 in 100 cases, interferon causes autoimmune disease, and that's what happened to me. So now, if I go in anything but low levels of light, if I stand in the sun or natural daylight, or if I sit under what most people would consider normal levels of lighting, then interior lighting, then my face swells up and suppurates, and in fact that's happening to all my organs. So I spend my life pretty much in the dark and had to resign from the job that I loved.
Well, Dan, you've been involved in this campaign to get this inquiry. Explain to us why you believe it's necessary and what are your expectations of it, given what we said about the furore that met the publication of the Penrose Inquiry?
Well, we're cautiously optimistic about this new inquiry because of the problems we saw with Penrose don't seem to be repeated. We're still in very early days, and obviously there's a long way to go. But the terms of reference for the new inquiry include the accusations of cover-up. We've had documents destroyed over the year. People have got gaps in their medical records, and that's something that this inquiry will look at.
Does it need to name names?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've always said that we need the investigations need to just follow where the evidence goes, without fear or favour, and that's a phrase that we've been pleased to hear the inquiry chairman, Sir Brian, using as well. Without fear or favour means where there's fault or where there's things that could be learnt, because you can't learn lessons from a disaster like that unless you're prepared to say somebody did something wrong. Not necessarily in all cases out of badness or ill intent, but mistakes were certainly made. Otherwise, if you don't think mistakes were made, then you're accepting that all these deaths and ruined lives are just acceptable collateral damage of medical progress. And I don't think, sitting here in 2019, we're prepared to think like that about the world.
Jill, what were your thoughts about the Penrose inquiry and its conclusion that the NHS couldn't really have done anything differently?
I don't agree with that conclusion. I was very disappointed by the Penrose inquiry. I felt it was incredible that when there is so much suffering still going on today, and historic suffering by so many thousands of people, I thought it was incredible that there was one small recommendation which didn't address any of their suffering. I have great hopes of this new inquiry. I've met the inquiry team. I think they're excellent. The chairman is extremely committed. I have great faith in him, and I think that because he is listening to evidence from so many victims, a true picture will be built of what people have suffered and what their losses have been.
And the reality is, it's not just those who received the contaminated blood. As you say, there was the anxiety around whether you'd infected your children, how this has impacted on family life, and you and your family will be giving evidence to this inquiry, won't you?
Yes, and when I listened to my family making their witness statements, it was it brought home to me that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't cope with this, with an infected blood disaster, and none of us can. We need help. No one can cope with it. And if you listen to the live streaming from those people, which you can do on YouTube, from those people who have already given evidence, it is absolutely heartbreaking. You can't bring back the family they have lost or the health they have lost, but the one thing that can be solved is that they have lost their homes, their pensions, all their savings. That can be addressed. So that's the only thing that can be done now.
And Dan, is that your hope as well, that some sort of financial recompense can be exacted at the end of this? Absolutely. The big outstanding financial question here is the historic damages. As Jill was just explaining, people lost careers, businesses, opportunities. The potential that they had before they were infected was taken away from them. And although there are some support payments now, there's no compensation. And if we'd had a court case and people had been able to establish liability in court, they would have had those losses repaid to them. And that's the big question on the financial side. Those losses have just not been paid. Well, look, thank you both very much for speaking to us this morning. That's Gill Fyffe, who's been living with the effect of infected blood for 30 years, and Dan Farthing, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Haemophilia Scotland. 8:16.